60 knots.
Check.
V1. Rotate.
Is this mic on?
The mics are on.
Okay, welcome back to the Northern Lights Blue Skies podcast. We are your hosts once again. I am Trisha.
And my name is Aryan.
And we'd like to thank you for episode number 3. It's going to be a special one. We've got a very special guest with us. We have Judy Cameron. She was the first female pilot at Air Canada, making history back in 1978. Again, being the first female pilot hired by the company, which also marked a significant milestone for Canadian women in aviation. She had a very extensive career, which you'll find through this podcast. She flew a variety of aircraft from small bush planes to the 67, the 777. And from there, her trailblazing career has definitely taken off. So we'd like to welcome you, Judy, to our podcast.
Thank you for having me.
How are you today?
I'm good.
Yeah. Are you excited? This is one of your first podcasts you mentioned.
Absolutely. And I'm really enjoying the fact that I know my 2 hosts. They're such hardworking members of the Northern Lights Junior Board.
So we met, Aryan and I met Judy through the Northern Lights Aero Foundation. We work under her with the outreach committee. She's our committee lead. And from there, she also mentors us with a bunch of other stuff, especially with this podcast. And it's been nice getting to know her. So we'd like to introduce Judy and have everyone else in aviation and aerospace get to know who she is.
Yes, the Judy Cameron.
The Judy Cameron that we mentioned in episode 0.
Yeah, Judy, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into aviation, how your career was, and where you are now?
Sure. It was really completely by accident. I had no one in my family who flew, although I should point out that my mother, who's now 100 years old, was in the Air Force, but she wasn't flying. She was flying a typewriter. She was a stenographer back during World War II. And she's always been one of my biggest supporters. In fact, I owe it a lot to her because there's not too many mothers back in the 70s when their daughter came home and said, I'm going to be a pilot. I'd like to be an airline pilot, that would actually encourage them. Yeah. She was my biggest supporter and my biggest positive role model. So going back, I grew up in Vancouver and I took first year arts at the University of BC. I had no idea what I wanted to be, but I decided by the end of that summer, between first and second year, I'd better start making some positive career plans. And as luck would have it, I got a job with Transport Canada. And it was a really unusual summer job. I ended up interviewing pilots that were flying small airplanes all around the Vancouver area. And of course, Transport Canada had found that they had much better luck using young university female students when they were asking questions of the mostly male pilots. They were much more receptive, a little less suspicious of someone working for Transport Canada. And the very first day on the job, most of us were invited to go flying. So we would leave our clipboard and our pencil with someone else, and off we'd go. Well, my first flight in a small airplane was an absolutely epic experience. It was a fellow that I'd known from high school. He was working on his commercial license, and he took me up in a Cessna 150 and proceeded to try and impress me, doing a spin, a stall. And he asked me at one point, do you want to see a pencil float from the front of the airplane to the back? And foolishly I said yes. And I found myself hanging on to the sides of my seat and screaming as if I was on a ride at an exhibition. I loved it. After we landed, I started asking, well, how do you go about being a pilot? I quickly found it was really expensive. I'd have to find somebody else who would pay me to fly. And then someone told me about this aviation college way up in the BC interior, Selkirk College. I got on my only form of transportation, which happened to be my red Honda 750 motorcycle. And I rode the 8 hours up to Castlegar.
On a motorcycle?
On a motorcycle.
Wow.
It was nice, it was the summer.
Yeah.
And when I got there, the head of the aviation program turned out to also have a motorcycle. And I feel this probably helped me considerably because I had no experience in aviation, no background whatsoever. In fact, I ended up grabbing a Time Life book and reading like the theory of flight, trying to figure out how these things actually worked. And even worse, because I was in an arts program at UBC, I didn't have the requirements to get into this aviation program. So I had to take grade 12 math in summer school just so I'd have the qualifications.
Yeah.
So I often tell kids, one of my pieces of advice is don't limit your options in high school. If you're not sure where you're going, don't eliminate a lot of these STEM programs. You might need maths and sciences. You might go in a totally different direction.
Yeah.
So I was lucky to be accepted into this program. And then I began 2 years of a rather difficult time for me. I was the only female in a class of 30 guys. And they were nice mostly. I mean, ignoring me was probably the kindest thing a lot of them did. But there were practical jokes. And I found calculus very difficult. And I still remember the very first day in Aviation 101, the instructor got up in front of the room and said, as we all know, F equals M times A. And I'm going, what's F? What's F? I mean, I hadn't taken any physics background, so that was rather challenging.
Yeah.
And I was also the only female in the class, so I didn't really hang out with the guys too much. It was kind of rough. But I really liked flying. I always had done a lot of sports, and I found that the actual manipulating of the controls came fairly easily, and I really, really enjoyed it. So I pressed on, and then between first and second year, there was a class interview with Pacific Western Airlines. Now, I didn't really understand how airline hiring worked. In fact, I thought I would just finish this course and I'd be an airline pilot. Someone would hire me. It was pretty naive. But in fairness, there had been students in classes ahead of me who'd been hired directly by Canadian Pacific. But the airlines were during a layoff period. We were still going down to Vancouver. We had our class interview. At the end of the interview, the chief pilot said, do you have any questions? And so I put my hand up and I asked the obvious question, do you think you'll ever consider hiring female pilots? And his answer was, well, it's not entirely out of the realm of human possibility. So that was a bit of an eye-opener for me.
Yeah.
And at that point, the airlines were not hiring. When I graduated in 1975, they were in a layoff cycle. So for the next 3 years, I did put my time in on smaller airplanes. And it was great. I think anybody who has that experience to fly up north should take it. It was really rewarding.
You mentioned your mother. Was there anyone other than your immediate family, potentially your extended family or friends, family friends, that were involved in aviation aerospace that you could lean on during this time?
Actually, there was really nobody that I knew in the aviation profession. My mom was a single mother. My uncle was a tugboat captain, so there was some parallel there. Later on, during my career, when I was doing my captaincy, he gave me quite a bit of encouragement, and that was lovely. But no, I knew absolutely no one. And the hard part for me, mentorship is a really big thing now. People talk a lot about mentorship, and I was asked if I had any female mentors. Well, I didn't know about Rosella. I think I found out about her later. And of course, I was in Vancouver and she was in Alberta. But I had very little contact with female pilots. There was, however, one time when a citation landed in Castlegar. And the first officer was female. It was an air ambulance service for the BC government. And we were all excited, my classmates and I. You know, we walked around the airplane and we all wanted to talk to her. And I did my usual thing. I started asking every question I could think of. And she said, you, come with me. And I thought, this is great. I'm going to get a special briefing, you know, female to female. We went around the corner of the building and she looked at me and she said, you know, the questions you're asking make you look really stupid in front of the guys. Maybe you should just keep your mouth shut if you know, don't have anything valuable to add. I was so shocked and so hurt that for a while I stopped asking questions, but after a while I went right back to my regular. That was my way of learning things. Yeah. And I found years later, when I was a captain, the fact that I was open and I would admit if I didn't know something, they would say something to me like, well, there's something I've always wanted to know about this airplane. And they'd ask a question that they thought maybe was making them look foolish and they hadn't asked anybody else.
Okay, so moving on from when you started in your flight training, you were obviously the first woman accepted into Air Canada as a pilot. Can you tell us about the early challenges you faced during that time coming into Air Canada?
I felt actually quite welcomed. It was a different experience from when I'd been in flight school. There were 12 of us in the class at Air Canada, 11 fellows and myself. And nicely enough, 2 of the other guys were willing to study with me, which really helped me going through ground school. And our seniority was determined by marks, so it was really quite competitive. And the funny part was, of the 3 of us, one of us came first, one of us came last, and I was in the middle, which I thought was quite respectable. I was 5th out of 12. There were a few moments, though, during ground school. I know at one point when I'd gone out to the washroom, when I came back, apparently there'd been quite a heated discussion about one of the guys, who's quite a nice guy, later on became a friend of mine, but he'd been saying kind of sadly, well, you know, it's okay to have a woman in the class, but I always thought of it as kind of a band of brothers before. And now that's kind of ruined. And apparently none of them wanted to be lower in seniority than me. So the comment from one of the instructors was, now we know how to raise the marks in ground school. We just have to have a woman on the course because the spread was 2% from top to bottom. It was.
You made them all work a lot harder.
Oh, that was his theory, which I thought was quite funny.
So you mentioned you did do a lot of bush flying. If you could pave how you went from graduating, doing that, flying up north, and then how did you get to Air Canada?
I was hired by a company in the forest industry. They had a corporate jet. I didn't have a lot of experience, but I think the chief pilot just was quite interested in the fact that I was a novelty, a female pilot. However, after he'd considered hiring me, the board of directors met, and under no circumstances was I going to be flying any of their airplanes. So I ended up being summer help. I was a dispatcher. I even was an apprentice mechanic for one day. I found out I was truly terrible at that. The joke was I had about a 10-foot memory, and the engine we were taking things off and the ones we were putting things back on was 20 feet apart. So I would forget immediately after taking a part off. I was just working for fun that day. They needed an extra set of hands. However, the company that did hire me was flying between Vancouver and Victoria. It was Air West Airlines. Okay. And I was an asset to them because they needed someone to work in the reservations office. This was all females. So I was at the airport working in reservations, but when the Twin Otter on wheels needed a co-pilot, it had to have a co-pilot or a flight attendant if it had more than 12 passengers, and it was cheaper to pay a co-pilot. So they would get someone to sit in the right seat, and normally they would have to get one of the other junior pilots who was a dock boy down at the Vancouver Harbor, and they'd have to put him in a taxi to come out to the airport. Now suddenly they had me. I was on site in the reservations office. So that's how I got to fly a Twin Otter back and forth. And, you know, the weather can be quite foggy in Vancouver in the winter. So it was great experience. I got some great IFR experience. And I flew right seat for a while in a King Air on some of the charters. So that was great. But then I heard about a job opening up in Slave Lake, Alberta. And I called, and the chief pilot wanted to interview me. So I flew up there, met him in Edmonton, flew up on the Sced run, which was a DC-3. And we got to Slave Lake, and he asked all the questions and basically said, "You're hired." But then is when the fun began, because the flight back from Slave Lake to Edmonton on the Sced run, I was standing in the flight deck, and he said, "Why don't you hop in and do the landing in Edmonton?"
Wow.
The other company I worked for, I literally had gone out in a DC-3 and done one circuit. So I really had no experience whatsoever, and this is how badly I wanted the job. I said, sure. And I'm pretty sure anybody who experienced that landing in Edmonton will remember it. It was probably the worst landing of my entire career, but he'd hired me and I was still hired. So I moved to Slave Lake, and I got checked out on the DC-3, and I got checked out on the Cessna 180. But unfortunately, 4 months later, all our paychecks bounced. The company went bankrupt. But this had been my big break, because now I had a DC-3 endorsement. And then a company called Gateway Aviation out of Edmonton took over their runs. And I do remember going in and having the job interview with the chief pilot. And he was kind of wondering if he should hire a woman. But then he said, well, at least none of the airlines will never hire you. And I got the job. And I was in Edmonton for all of 3 weeks when they decided to send me up to Inuvik, 200 kilometers north of the Arctic
Yeah.
Circle,
Wow.
and I was to be the only DC-3 co-pilot with the captain. And that turned out to be very interesting. I mean, the flying was interesting. We did all of our own loading.
Yeah.
6,000 pounds per trip.
Wow.
A DC-3 is a tail dragger, so everything had to be pulled uphill. And my story is I was pretty good at loading the fuel drums. They weighed 355 pounds each. It's all about how you roll them and its leverage. But the unloading was a problem. The first time I tried the fuel drum, I'm rolling it down the aisle. It actually got away from me, and it almost created a new exit right out the tail. So after that, I wasn't allowed to do that anymore. I was outside while the captain rolled the fuel drums to the door, and then I would put them in position. But in addition to the interesting flying we did, we were flying to all the DuLine sites and a lot of the Inuit settlements. In addition to that, it was also very good CRM, cockpit resource management training, because this captain was very difficult to fly with. Let's just say communication wasn't his forte, so some days I wouldn't get to touch the controls, other days I'd be flying a lot. He was really hard on his co-pilots. It wasn't just me. The fellow I was replacing looked like he was escaping when I was when I first arrived. I got off the scheduled flight from Edmonton, and I noticed this guy just kept looking at me. It almost like he was afraid I would get away before he could get on the flight and leave. I found out why shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
I'll just leave it at that. It was great training for me to
Yeah.
maybe put up with a difficult personality.
And then from there, did you go straight to Air Canada, or?
Oh, no, unfortunately, they laid me off. It got slow in the winter. So I went back to Edmonton, where they quickly hired me back as a dispatcher.
Okay.
And then I would get to go out as a DC-3 co-pilot. And finally, they trained me on their biggest airplane, the Hawker Siddeley 748. And this was wonderful, 48 passengers. I got to wear a uniform. I didn't have to load freight. Fantastic. And I was really having a great time. I flew it for a couple of months. Air Canada started hiring. And they called me. And I actually considered telling them, maybe I'll take your job offer in a couple of months, because I'm just finally flying full time in a much bigger airplane than I've ever flown. But one of my friends dragged me aside and said, you can't do that. It's a seniority system, and you'll lose a lot if you don't take the offer. So I went to Montreal and had my medical for Air Canada, and came back again for an interview. Didn't want the airline that I was working for at the time to know about this, because they just trained me and they'd be upset that they spent the money finally training me on the Hawker Siddeley.
Yeah.
Only 2 weeks later, I got a call saying I was hired by Air Canada, and I was absolutely ecstatic. But I was scrambling, because back in the day, accommodations weren't provided, so I had to find a place to stay. I had no car, no way of getting to school. And what was really wonderful was this is where networking starts to rear its head. A pilot for the company I worked for knew someone that worked for Nord Air, who knew someone who had a flight attendant girlfriend who was looking for a roommate. So I had a place to stay.
Wow.
And when I got to Montreal that night, thinking that maybe I could take rapid transit somehow to the airport, because it was at least 20 minutes away, a Nord Air pilot lent me his beater of a car. He just said, don't go over any bumps too fast, because the gas tank's held on with chicken wire. And I had my wheels.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was really, really nice. I can't thank these people enough for helping me.
It seems like at every turn in your career, you're hitting another wall, and you had to find a way to push past it and push past it. How did you keep yourself motivated throughout that entire time?
Or sane.
Well, I was really young. I was 23 when I was hired by Air Canada. And it hadn't really occurred to me to have a plan B. Like when I went through my flying training, I had no money. I had to sell my motorcycle to pay for my training. My mom contributed as much as she could, but I had student loans, bursaries. That's why scholarships are so important to me now. But I don't know. I think I was just really optimistic. I had thought that if I got really old, like 30, maybe bush flying wasn't the best career, because a lot of things did happen when I was up north. I had a few close calls, like engine failures on the DC-3 and equipment failures, things that made me consider maybe this wasn't the safest line of work. But I really don't know. I just think I had quite a bit of determination. I probably got that from my mom. she always encouraged me, and she was very determined, very stubborn.
Did she ever speak to you about how she felt while you were doing all this? Did you ever have conversations about, hey, Mom, like, what do you think about this? Or was she always from the get-go supportive of this role? Was she ever nervous for you as your mother?
If she was nervous, she never admitted it. And, she was dead set against me buying the motorcycle, but yet she was my first passenger on the back.
Yeah.
And she was also my first passenger in an airplane.
Yeah.
I don't really know how to account for it now. I look back and think, what was I thinking? My chances weren't that good. Rosella was hired by Transair in Winnipeg in 1973, but there hadn't been any women hired by a major airline. However, I knew things were changing in the 70s, and the airlines were looking. You could tell they were getting ready to hire women. A lot of things were changing. But the other thing I had going for me was that I was 5'7", and that was the minimum height requirement by Air Canada, which eliminated a lot of women, and it was really unfair. Later on, that was challenged. I know there has to be a minimum height so you can reach the controls and reach the overhead panel and also the rudder pedals, but 5'7" was definitely not that number.
Yeah.
When you got accepted into Air Canada, did you know that you were going to be the first female in the company, or did that come to you afterwards?
No, I knew I was going to be the first female, and it became painfully obvious as I was going through my training because people from every department in the company would just happen to look in on our class. It became kind of funny after a while. The guys would laugh. And we'd walk into the lunchroom at the Dorval base. And at one point, I walked in with a friend, and literally the whole room went quiet and appeared to look at us. And I thought I was imagining it until he pointed out. I said, I think they're looking at you, Dominic.
Like, it's not me.
Yeah. After I finished my training, the company was nice enough to wait till after I finished my basic ground school, and I was checked out as a second officer on the 727, that I was to do an interview with the press, which consisted of me walking into the Dorval airport in uniform and being surrounded. It looked like one of those media scrums that you see with the politicians. Yeah. I was surrounded by the media, and everybody was asking questions and in my face. But the person I remember most was the female reporter who said, well, I'm just going to ask you things like, where'd you go to school? How did you get interested in flying? And then once the the camera was on, she looked straight at me, and after she asked my name, she said, so how do you feel about flying despite the ravages of premenstrual tension?
Oh my goodness.
And I thought that was just a low blow coming from another woman.
One of the career paths that a lot of young aviators right now consider going up north, just like you had done, Judy, to gain their hours, gain some experience, because the industry, they're looking for experience before you step into the right seat there. So why don't you tell us a bit about what it was like being up north? You mentioned some scary stories, some close calls. Anything to prepare those youngsters that are going up north for the first time?
I really am glad I had the experience of flying up north. But I have to say, sometimes it could be a little bit hazardous. We were flying DC-3s. They are piston aircraft, sometimes in very low temperatures. And I did experience a couple of engine failures. One was with Bayview Air Services. We were in northern Alberta, between two places in a heavily treed area, and we lost one of the engines on the DC-3 with passengers, and that was actually my checkout flight. So it was like, wow, welcome to this kind of flying.
Yeah.
It was absolutely beautiful, but the temperatures, I only experienced part of a winter up in Inuvik. I didn't do as much extensive real bush flying as a lot of other people, but boy, it was cold. Yeah. And at anything past about minus 40, things tend to snap. It's really interesting. I'm glad I think anyone has the opportunity to do it, should do it, because it's really valuable experience. And I was so glad I got to fly the DC-3 because it's such a vintage airplane, super heavy on the controls. So when I transitioned to anything else, it was a little bit hard not to manhandle them after that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great experience. I had about 1,200 hours on the DC-3, and I'm glad.
And then you went back down to Edmonton.
I was laid off and went back to Edmonton, and then again got checked out on the Hawker Siddeley 748. And when I did get hired by Air Canada, there was a bit of interest by the press. And I still remember it was quite funny because the chief pilot for Gateway He was a nice fellow to fly with, but he was a little bit of a chauvinist, and he used to say stuff like, another empty kitchen, when he heard a female on the air. So the best part was when the reporter put the mic in his face and said, so tell me, how do you feel about female pilots? Actually, I initiated that. I said, why don't you ask Pat how he feels about flying with female pilots? And he had to say all good things because he knew otherwise he was going to get a lot of fan mail. It was quite funny. I set him up for that.
Yeah. When these comments happened, I assume they were very passive because it was, again, I assume common back then. How did you feel? Did you think about each and every comment that was made? Did they hit home, or was it just another joke that someone made?
I actually thought a lot of times that it was funny, although, you know, if I heard one more time, tell that fellow he's got his seatbelt done up too tight. I mean, they think they're so original. A lot of things back in the day would not be acceptable now. I'll leave it at that. But I had a sense of humor. And a lot of times I felt the guys were just trying to make me one of the guys rather than make me feel uncomfortable. Especially after I joined Air Canada, most of the guys were really professional. I started off as a second officer, which is a position, as you know, it's no longer because of the changes in technology. I was monitoring a panel that had all the systems on the airplane, and I sat behind the captain and the first officer, and I didn't actually fly. And it was a great way to get introduced to the airline. But the guys I was flying with were a lot older than me. I was actually younger than a lot of their daughters. I would call the captain sir, and they'd say, stop saying that. You make me feel so old.
Yeah.
But I was treated quite well for the most part. There were exceptions, but I was treated quite well, and there were practical jokes. And yes, there was a lot of comments that wouldn't be acceptable now. But I very seldom took it to heart.
Yeah. And those small moments that it did hit home and you took it to heart, that you were uncomfortable, what did you do to persevere in those moments? Or a piece of advice for any other woman that is also facing some hardships when it comes to their gender and where they work? What could you tell them to help them move past that moment?
Things are so different now. There's things that were acceptable then are not acceptable, and there's mechanisms in place. It wouldn't be acceptable nowadays to have a Playboy or a Hustler magazine centerfold across the front of the flight deck and turn around and say to the second officer, what do you think of this? Mm-hmm. I know that back in the day, some of the other women fought back quite successfully. They, for example, when they were nude pictures of women in the performance charts, they replaced them with nude pictures of men, which I thought was quite funny. I hadn't thought of that one. I think now the fact that there are more women, you can basically band together and mechanisms are in place. Things are just not acceptable. Yeah. Sorry, I can't come up with a better response for you, because generally I just ignored it or laughed at it or walked away from it. Yeah.
No, I think that's powerful, because what you said there, band together, I think that's also a big takeaway for those women, to find a community where other women can support you through that. So no, I do think what you said was powerful there.
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, from what I've learned so far, you had natural skills that helped you in the plane. And then you also had great motivation to just keep going. Mm-hmm. And you didn't let these little things kind of get in your way and stop you. You just kept going and going, and you reach your goals. But
they weren't even little things. Like, they were financial barriers. Yes, they were, you know, the industry itself, barriers, the ups and downs of the aviation world.
And then there was the uniform. That was the big issue, because they didn't have a hat for female pilots. And I was given a choice of 6 prototypes, and some of them were truly awful. One looked like I was riding a horse. The hat that I chose ended up being the source of a great deal of ridicule. It was a felt bowler, and I think the best comment I had was I looked like I was portaging a canoe. But the airline was nice enough back in the day. If you can imagine, in 1978, they tried to get a female version of the uniform. So instead of a tie, I wore an ascot, which was really ahead of the times. Later on, it changed, and all the female pilots pretty much wore a tie and went back to the male hat. But they tried hard to make me feel welcome, and that was a change. Obvious differences are pregnancy. Before I was hired, the vice president of flight operations called me before I started course to tell me that if I was pregnant, I wouldn't be able to fly. And I remember I was just thinking, how is this relevant? I was married when I joined the airline, but I hadn't thought of starting a family. And I couldn't even see why he was telling me this. It's quite funny later because, as you know, I ended up having 2 daughters. I did have a family, but I was so focused on my career that I hadn't even considered starting a family. And this was probably the most difficult part for me in my career. I found it very hard coming back to work with a small child. And that's something I think we need to support more women when they go through this really important part of their lives. It's fairly early on in their career. So there could be more support, better maternity uniforms, the option to have block sharing, maybe a little more time off after. Because I wasn't allowed to fly while I was pregnant with my first daughter, I basically didn't tell the airline for the first few months, flew a bit in the middle trimester, and then ended up doing duties on the ground afterwards and having to come back to work when my daughter was 2.5 months old. And I think that was the most difficult part of my career. I was a DC-9 first officer. I was doing early morning flights by choice because I wanted to be home with my baby. So I'd fly to North Bay and Timmins, which meant that I'd be home in the afternoon. I had to report for work at 6 a.m., but I'd be home by perhaps 2 in the afternoon. And I'd be so tired that I took the hint from the flight attendants. They were all young mums too with the same schedule. When we got up to Timmins, we had a couple of hours off. Everybody would grab a pillow, run to the back of the DC-9, fold down the armrests, and have a nap. And it was great.
Yeah. Was anything different the second time around with your second daughter?
Things had changed in that I flew a little more. But the first time I got pregnant, honestly, they didn't know what to do with me. The union met with the company and they kind of decided that I would basically take the last 3 months off and do other duties. No, it changed by the time I had my youngest daughter. It changed so that group disability covered pregnancy. Because believe it or not, our disability insurance, when I was pregnant with my first daughter, it covered things like acts of war, intentional self-mutilation, but not pregnancy. So, and it had changed so that by the time I was pregnant with my youngest daughter and quite nauseated, I was able to take some time off work.
Yeah.
How did you feel your responsibilities shifted and the culture of the company shifted as you worked your way from first officer to captain?
Well, first of all, it took 20 years for me to become a captain back in the day.
Oh,
I know
wow.
things have changed a lot since then.
Significantly, yeah.
Yeah, I waited until I could hold captaincy on the DC-9. So my friend Glennis was actually the first female captain with Air Canada. She was hired after me by about a year. However, she took her captaincy on the RJ. So it would have been a pay cut for me. So I waited till I could hold the DC-9. It was 20 years. And finally, I got in the left seat. And the cool part about that was that now I was able to fly with other female pilots for the first time. I really, really enjoyed that. And I had a lot of female FOs. And then for the rest of my career, I did too. And I noticed a gradual shift. You know, I'd always been the novelty, but now there were more females hired. Not a lot, granted, but still enough to fly with. And I noticed that the guys I flew with had been perhaps instructed by a woman, or they worked with women before, and now there were women in the military. So things had changed considerably.
Yeah. Do you remember your first flight with a female?
Yes, it was quite funny in a way. We dead-headed to Montreal, and there was a wild snowstorm going on. And that was still in the day when you could have people in the flight deck. Actually, this person would have been able to come in the flight deck anyway. And a captain that was quite high up in management was asking for the flight deck. Well, I hadn't flown with the other female pilot before.
And were you the first officer or the captain?
I was the captain.
Okay.
The first officer and I dead-headed to Montreal. And the passenger agent asked if a very senior Czech captain could sit in the flight deck. And I looked at her and I thought, you know what? No. That's why I made my first big decision as a captain. And I leaned over and I said to her, not today, okay? Look outside, look at the weather. I knew we were going to be de-icing. There was going to be a lot of stuff going on. And I just thought, I don't need that extra pair of eyes. So she gave some excuse to him. I would laugh about it later. It probably would have been fine, but he had a bit of a reputation for being a
stickler.
Yeah. And I just thought, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So the flight went well.
So could you speak a bit more about your transition and your upgrade to captain? You said that it took 20 years. How was that? How did you feel in this leadership role, quite literally being the decision maker of all of your passengers on board and supporting a first officer with you? What was that like?
Well, first of all, I really enjoyed it. I was thrilled to finally be in the left seat. But it's funny, all those decisions that it seemed so obvious to me when I was in the right seat and hypercritical of the person making them didn't become quite as obvious when I was in the left seat.
Yeah.
And sometimes I would feel myself almost turning to the left, and then I realized, nope, there's no one there. I'm it.
Wrong way.
It became a lot easier as I went along. It was good. And it was nice to be able to make some of the big decisions too. You know, you always had input as a first officer, but I could definitely decide that I was not going to get that close to a thunderstorm, a cell as we're going around. I might choose to take a slightly greater detour.
Yeah.
And it was fine. It was my decision.
Did it mean anything to you personally? I know professionally, obviously, it must have been an achievement, but personally, was that upgrade to captain anything, or was it just another a thing in your logbook?
No, I mean, it's enough work that you really feel it is quite an achievement, and it's something you really look forward to all your career. So when the flight attendant brought up my cup of tea that I'd ordered, and the check captain I was with had asked her to put my captain's epaulets and my wings on it, I did something I'd never done at work before or since. I burst into tears.
Wow.
And the check pilot I was with was so uncomfortable. I thought he was going to crawl right out of the airplane.
Yeah.
It was only for a moment. I didn't see it coming, and then I was fine. The only other time in my 37-year career that I shed a tear was my retirement flight. And just after landing, it kind of hit me just for a moment. But then I looked at my first officer, who was wearing a GoPro on her head so she could record the landing. And she looked so ridiculous. I started laughing. Both times. No, for me, it felt like a big achievement. I think it is for any pilot in their career.
Yeah.
And perhaps the fact that I had to wait so long to do it, the build-up was there.
Yeah. So throughout the training, the flying up north, being in Edmonton, nothing had made you cry, no matter the uncomfortability or the comments, everything, you still persevered.
Nothing made me cry at work. I might have cried on the way home.
Yeah.
or perhaps, the probably one of the most difficult periods was flying up in Inuvik with this particular captain.
Yeah.
And things got a lot better with the airline. I mean, the great thing about airline flying is you get to meet a lot of different people. You're flying with... Back in the day, you flew with the same captain for a month, so woe betide you if you got with someone who wasn't pleasant. But it seldom happened. For the most part, I enjoyed everyone I worked with. I learned a lot from the captains, and it was pretty positive.
Did you ever face any resilience after your promotion to captain from the rest of your crew? For example, when you fly with first officers that are men, did you ever have any issues in the cockpit?
Oddly enough, yes, a few times I did. I'd spoken to other captains, though, and sometimes it wasn't just me. There was the occasional first officer that tried to run away with the ship, become the captain. And that was a bit challenging, but they were few and far between.
It seems like Air Canada has kind of been ahead of the rest when it comes to inclusivity, diversity, even in your time.
Yeah, they have been. And maybe this is slightly off topic, but the flight attendants were some of my biggest cheerleaders right from the start. I wasn't sure, because the smaller company I work with, they only had a couple of flight attendants and they were my friends. I wasn't sure how I'd be treated at Air Canada, but the flight attendants were great. And if they ever got whiff of the fact that a passenger was making comments, they got terrible service. And if the flight deck crew weren't nice to me too, they would be on my side. But that rarely ever happened. They were wonderful to work with.
Yeah.
In fact, they gave me a nice little... I was invited to speak to a group of retired flight attendants, and they gave me a beautiful trophy of an airplane, which I thought was really supportive and wonderful.
Yeah.
Nothing like the support from other women. And in fact, when passengers came on board, the ones that usually made the nicest comments were the little old ladies. They're happy to see a woman in the flight deck.
I know we're going to backtrack a bit, but you mentioned your mom was also your first passenger. Was this when you were just training, or was this your first passenger when you were hired? And what was that flight like for you?
It was when I had my private pilot's license between first and second year at the college. So I had probably a grand total of maybe 40 or 50 hours. And she didn't know any better. So she accompanied me in a Cessna 150. And we just flew around the Castlegar area. And she was fine. She's not a nervous passenger at all.
Yeah.
So yeah.
She must have been so proud.
She was. She was.
Okay.
But in honesty, I think she would have preferred if I'd been a doctor.
Yeah.
So now you've been in the industry for quite a while. After Air Canada, you at some point got involved with us with the Northern Lights. But with all of your experience within the industry, what advancements have you noticed in safety and technology that have changed the most during your career, transformed the industry the most?
Well, first of all, I went from being a second officer in charge of all those systems to flying highly automated aircraft with only 2 flight crew in it instead of 3. So that was a huge change. And then going from something like a steam-driven or steam-powered DC-9 with round gauges to something with CRT screens, a 767, and programming an airplane. Those are huge jumps in technology. And then, of course, things like weather prediction got better. I mean, we didn't have WSI back in the day. You just got a really good briefing from flight dispatch, and you were flying with VORs and ADFs going across country, and sometimes there were weather surprises that weren't predicted. The radar got a lot better. The radar on the DC-9 just was one color only, and sometimes it was difficult to tell whether you were looking at a city or a cell. And I had one funny experience happen to me. I was flying with kind of a crusty captain. He had one of his cronies up on the flight deck, another pilot, and they were laughing at me because I was pointing out what I thought was a cell over Toronto. And they were, oh, no, that's just the city. But the funny part was we got closer and there was lightning and I was right. And it got really quiet. Yeah. So the radar was a lot better on aircraft later. And of course, the navigational systems changed too. Inertial navigation came in and now the technology, I retired 9 years ago. It's come even further. So I saw great changes.
Yeah. And I guess it's always still changing nowadays. Now we're getting into conversations of a one-man pilot aircraft, which is a whole other thing.
Did you say man?
Oh my God. Oh my God.
Ariane.
No, sorry. Busted.
Got to find a new co-host.
I'm leaving.
He's actually blushing. You can't see that. No, I knew what you meant. And I totally knew what you meant.
Well, on the topic of changes that you've seen with safety and technology, you spoke about CRM and how that wasn't anything until you transitioned into the airlines. Let's also talk about how the role of a woman in aviation evolved since you started. So, of course, again, with your transition into Air Canada, they were a little more mindful of how to perhaps adapt the uniform or how to work with the fact that you were about to have a baby. Closer to the latter half of your career, were there any other significant changes when you were about to go into retirement compared to when you started with Air Canada?
Well, there's a great emphasis now on diversity and inclusion and the interest in trying to hire the half of the population that's so underrepresented, and groups like Black Aviation Professional Network and Urban Pilot Network and Canadian Aviation Pride. I think this is wonderful because really diversity is strength, and more female pilots with Air Canada than ever before. I think there's almost 700 now. I have to check on the exact number. But it was wonderful when I could finally walk into flight planning and not know all the female pilots. But I made a concerted effort back in the day to try and introduce myself to any woman I saw in flight planning. And I used to have a get-together at my house once a year, which then morphed into a bigger group of us meeting at a restaurant to try and do this networking unofficially.
Well, the restaurant also sparks another point, the Northern Lights. How did you get involved with them, and at what point in your career did you start getting involved with these other groups of women and organizations to support women?
The very first group I got involved with was the International Society of Women Airline Pilots. It was 1981, and I attended one of their first get-togethers. I wasn't a charter member. That was a few years prior. I actually received a letter right after I joined Air Canada, and it was like, "Dear female pilot, we're having a get-together in Las Vegas, and would you like to come?" And believe it or not, I thought it was a hoax.
Wow.
I couldn't have gone anyway. My schedule wouldn't have allowed it.
Yeah.
But I did go to this get-together, and there was 51 female pilots. This is just around the time Air Canada had maybe hired 3 or 4, and I didn't know them. So it was just fantastic for me to be able to have this network of other women and speak to them. This is before the internet, before groups like Female Aviators stick together that are now wonderful, wonderful resources for women in aviation. So it was really, really wonderful to do this. I stayed a member of ISA for many years, but really didn't do anything much to help other women in aviation until after I retired. I was pretty busy flying, bringing up my 2 daughters as a single mom. Other than the unofficial get-togethers with the Air Canada female pilots, I didn't have much involvement. After I retired, Northern Lights awarded me their Flight Operations Award at their gala, and I got interested in the organization, and my friend Kathy Fraser had told me quite a bit about it. I was kind of surprised that Air Canada wasn't supporting the group. So I'd been invited to speak at an International Women's Day get-together by Air Canada. And Kaylin Rovanescu, who was the CEO at the time, introduced me. And I had the opportunity after I spoke to wave the Northern Lights program at him with ads from other airlines on it and say, "Do you think Air Canada would be interested in supporting something like this? Because you're obviously interested in supporting women in aviation. You invited me here to speak." And he said, "Yes, if you put through a request with your name on it, we'll have a look at it." That's how I ended up on the board of Northern Lights.
Yeah.
And became their fundraiser. Yeah. Something I'd never done before.
You're probably the best fundraising
the best
person.
one we know.
Yeah. Yeah, you're known for that in the board now.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I took some of the persistence and inability to say no that I had to start my career, and I've applied it to fundraising, which is kind of funny. It's kind of a challenge, and it's wonderful to see how many companies are now supporting Northern Lights and women in aviation. Air Canada is our title sponsor. They're our biggest supporter, but there's been lots of others. Porter was one of the first. Lots of the other airlines, pretty much all the major airlines are coming in. And then my involvement with Northern Lights, the next wonderful thing that happened was I've been invited on and off over the years to do speeches about my career. People are interested, and occasionally I'd be offered money to do this. And I really was looking for a way to put this to a good cause, so I started a little fund through Northern Lights for possibly a scholarship one day. Well, I mentioned it to some of the wonderful people I work with at Air Canada, and they decided that maybe they would like to join in, and they started a scholarship in my name, which was like the biggest honor of my life.
Yeah.
They started the Captain Judy Cameron Scholarship, and now it's going into its 6th year. Other companies have joined in, CAE, Sky Service, de Havilland, Sovereign Wealth Management. And at one point, I even got CIBC Bank 2 years running to contribute. So we've given out $180,000. I believe it's 34 scholarships to various women who are pursuing careers, Canadian women pursuing careers for flight training, and in the Air Canada case for aircraft maintenance engineers.
I think it is significant because earlier when we were speaking about you in training, you mentioned how you had a dream and how you would hope that one day that there could be a scholarship opportunity because you had to sell your motorcycle and find ways to make that money. So I do think that it's significant that companies are giving back to our younger generations, and specifically our women, to help support them through their journey.
And the really important thing for me in awarding these scholarships was the fact that it would go to women who weren't just concerned with their own career, but who were willing to help others, assist them in their journey by mentoring, by volunteering, particularly any kind of volunteering, but particularly something to help other women in aviation. And you, Tricia, are a shining example of this because you're one of our scholarship recipients this year.
Yeah. You mentioned you weren't really involved throughout your airline career with other organizations such as ISA or Northern Lights. Now that you had retired and you did join, what was that like? How did it feel to be a part of these organizations that were scarce when you were a student?
It's wonderful. It's just I'm probably spread a little bit too thin because I belong to the 99s. Mm-hmm. They're a wonderful group. I also belong to Women in Aviation International, the International Society of Women Airline Pilots, and I work with Northern Lights. We also collaborate with another group called Elevate, who are doing wonderful work out west, and they've got great programs for students. I'm sure you've seen them. Yeah. People have seen them online. And so, no, it's great. There's so many groups now that are trying to do the right thing to encourage others in aviation.
Does it ever create turmoil having these different groups of women? There's a lot of organizations. Do they ever, of course they overlap, but does it ever cause any issues? Knowing that you're involved with all of them, how have you found that do they work together?
They work together quite well. I just came back from the Elevate Gala on the weekend with another board member. Anna and I were there. They support us. We support them. I think that the need is so great and our country's so large that there's room for all of us.
Yeah.
In your career in aviation, how important is it for young women to have a role model or someone to look up to, a mentor, someone in their court? You had your mom on your side helping you out. But how is that for other people in the industry? Do you think it's vital?
I do think it's vital. And when I said I didn't have a mentor, I didn't have a female mentor, but the chief pilot that hired me for the small airline, the fellow that asked me to land the DC-3 in Edmonton at night, was actually a mentor in a way because he treated me just like one of the guys. He hired 3 pilots that day. 2 were men and the other was myself. And I just felt like one of the group. Didn't treat me any differently. He was very unconventional, and I was lucky to have that kind of mentorship. Mentorship is important, though, particularly for women, to see other women doing the career. Studies have shown that women are more successful. They feel like they have a better sense of belonging if they see other women performing a role. Mm-hmm. And the reason there's not so many female pilots is because they're just not that visible. So that's why it's important for groups like Northern Lights to get out and speak in the schools, mm-hmm. to do outreach events, and to have our mentorship program, which is quite successful. And we have people who've gone through the mentorship program who are now working in aviation. We know one who's selling aircraft, mm-hmm. a few others that are now right seat with various companies in Canada. So it proves that it works. I can't speak from a lot of personal experience. I think it would have been great to have had a female mentor. It would have been great to have that woman on the citation draw me aside, give me her personal contacts, say, call me anytime if you have any questions. Yeah. That would have been the ideal at the time. Yeah. So no, it's very important. That's why we like taking uniforms out to these events and getting little girls to try them on. And how does it feel? Yeah. Hold up a sign saying, this is your captain speaking. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you are a strong advocate for increasing diversity in the industry, along with the many other women that are on our board at Northern Lights or in different organizations. What else, though, do you think needs to be done to ensure that women thrive in aviation?
The financial part is really important. It's a big barrier for everybody. We'd love to see a lot more scholarships. It would be great to see other aviation companies, especially now that there's a pilot shortage at this time. It would be great. That's a big part of it. Scholarships, mentorship rather, very important. And it's important to talk to kids when they're younger, like elementary school mm-hmm. age, mm-hmm. preferably before high school, and they get notions about what society expects from them.
Yeah. That's something that Elevate has definitely tapped into that is monumental. I think that they have inspired us with the Northern Lights. Our junior board is now also looking to outreach into schools, elementary schools, and provide some sort of a presentation so that young girls or boys understand that there are careers in aviation and in aerospace. So definitely I agree with you on that.
Looking back on your career, do you have anything that you would have done differently or any regrets?
Ways that you would have approached things differently?
Mm-hmm. No, it's funny. I look back and there were just so many things that happened. I was in the right place at the right time. Riding that motorcycle, having the head of aviation have one too, being 5'7" when that was the minimum required. Although in honesty, I'm really 5'6" and 3/4. But I put my hair up in a bun. Yeah. There was a lot of like happy coincidence for me. I was just really lucky, right place, right time. And I don't regret a thing. I mean, I could look back and say, well, I did a lot of domestic flying when I could have done overseas flying because I wanted to be home at night with my kids. But it worked out for me. And that's another thing we haven't really touched on. Childcare is really important. And the thing about being an airline pilot is you can afford decent childcare. You have a job that pays well enough that even if you unfortunately get divorced and you are a single mom, you can make it work. You can hire someone to help you. So maybe the only regret I have perhaps is that I didn't do a little more overseas flying, but not really. I was happy that I was able to be home with my kids. And then I immensely enjoyed it in the latter parts of my career, whereas a lot of other guys at that point were kind of tired of it. They'd done enough. They'd seen the sunrise across the Atlantic enough.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, I don't have any regrets. Perhaps maybe one. The rules had changed and 65 was the retirement age. I left at 61. In retrospect, I was really enjoying it. I think I could have hung in there for another year or two.
Yeah.
But then I wouldn't have been working with Northern Lights. So
Yeah. For those women that aren't in the right place at the right time, the way you were, that are facing some hardships, what advice would you give to those young women who are interested in pursuing a career in aviation or aerospace, or are already dipping their toes into that pool and need some motivation?
All I can say is you just follow your dream and go for it. Don't let anyone dissuade you. Other people will try to discourage you. Don't discourage yourself. Just go for it. If you want it badly enough, you will attain it. Mm-hmm. Just keep trying.
And I think you have to give yourself a little bit more credit to right place, right time as well. But you pushed through all the barriers that we can see. And even now we know you to be a strong-willed, motivated person. So I can only imagine how that was back in the day. And nobody can see right now, but she's laughing. She's also very humble. She's very humble.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. But I have to say, going back again, the biggest honor in my life was having that scholarship named after me. And I got the Order of Canada last year, and that's a big one.
Yeah.
And again, I feel there's so many other people who do work quietly and aren't rewarded for it. No one notices. There's so many other people that really do deserve it more.
Yeah.
But it was, I appreciated it because I can at least use that perhaps in my fundraising.
Yeah.
No, it was the biggest honor was having the scholarship named after me, and I feel really good about that. And that would be, for me, that would be my legacy, having that scholarship and knowing I made a difference in a few people's lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that we'll continue to see more women in leadership roles in aviation and aerospace?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Times are changing.
What excites you about the future of aviation?
Oh, electric airplanes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Electric airplanes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you hope to see any changes with the efforts in diversity and inclusion, or is your main goal just to get more visibility out there for women to see other women?
No, I think all types of diversity are important. Not just, it's funny, I mean, the few times I flew with a pilot color, they sort of shared the same experiences that I had of being the one and only, and everybody remembers that they flew with you, and you better not mess up because they'll remember. I'd like to see that change. It's important. It's not just women are underrepresented, but so are a lot of ethnicities too. And I'd like to see that change.
Yeah.
Well, Judy, did you have any final thoughts for our listeners on breaking barriers or staying resilient in a very challenging, very long driven industry?
Just that it's worth it. Flying is a lot of fun, and you should pursue your dream.
Well, we'd like to thank you for meeting with us today.
Yeah, you are the Judy Cameron. For everybody who doesn't know
Judy
yet.
Cameron on here.
Well, the Trisha.
Yeah, definitely thank you for not only being our mentors, but mentoring other women that are listening to this. if you don't have the time to listen to the full hour, you listen to 5 minutes and you pick something from what we talked about today, and it helps you in some significant way, whether you be in aviation or aerospace or you're in a different field and it's just hard for you as a woman to pursue what you're dreaming. We hope that this conversation today helps open your eyes that you're not alone, and there's many other women that have gone through hardships, and Judy's here to exemplify that it's all worth it in the end.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And thank you for being such great volunteers for Northern Lights.
Now we return for landing with the end of our 3rd episode.
Wishing you blue skies and tailwinds ahead. We'll see you next time.